Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We're an open dialogue on education, the arts, and social change. And we're broadcasting our show today from the liberal Upper West Side, or what's often called the Upper Left Side of Manhattan. And we're in the home of Tom Siracuse, a very wonderful person who actually, in the early days of our show, he allowed us to come here and film him in his wonderful apartment on West 74th Street, right next to the Ansonia building. It's just a beautiful location, wonderful place. And Tom has such a big heart. He's such a kind person. And I just want to thank him for allowing us to film here. Over the years, we filmed a few great shows here. And he's just a good listener. He's a wonderful educator. And that's the first thing I want to say about Tom, is that Tom has taught for many years at George Washington High School here in Washington, up in Washington Heights, not too far. In fact, Claudia, if you move the camera and look at that photograph right there on the wall, you will see an image from Washington Heights, right?
That was painted by a teacher at George Washington High School.
Beautiful, beautiful. And also, to bring it back full circle to George Washington High, my mom went to George Washington High. So we have a lot of simpatico with that neighborhood. And I happen to be teaching there right now at Boricua College. I'm teaching an English class at Boricua College, 157th and Broadway, and Audubon Terrace. So our show is not a typical talk show. We are an open dialogue on education, the arts, and social change. Those are the three categories that we like to incorporate: education, art, and social change. So we're definitely going to get into some politics here today, because Tom was he's the chair emeritus of the Manhattan Green Party. Now he's the secretary of the Manhattan Green Party, so he's very active in politics. We see Tom around town also. Anytime there's a kind of an important thing going on in the community, like Occupy Wall Street, Tom was there. He's always on the scene when something really matters. So we're going to get into some politics. We are a nonprofit TV show, so we can't really advocate for a candidate, but we have had on our show this year so far, we had somebody on who was favorable to Trump, and he said what he had to say. We had somebody favorable to Hillary, who said that he thinks that Hillary should be the preferred candidate. Better to have Hillary get in and then work to move the Democratic Party to the left, okay? And in all fairness, we want to feature somebody from the Green Party, just to balance it out. And I did notice something good this year was that CNN actually featured Jill Stein on, which is progress, right? When you see in terms of balance on the media, if you go back 4 years ago, I think Jill Stein, who was the presidential nominee for the Green Party, had a harder time getting on the mainstream shows. Now it seems as if the media is opening up more. Tom, would you say that there's a trend in our country now in terms of as far as the Green Party? Are we more open to that now, especially after Bernie Sanders? His candidacy was very transformative in a way. It got a lot of young people very excited about, democracy and taking the country back from the corporations. Would you say that this could be a third-party moment now in our country?
Well, I don't know what you mean by third-party moment. I think it would be near a miracle if a third party actually came close to winning this time around. But the Bernie Sanders campaign did bring up issues, and the fact that he called himself a socialist. This did open up the political discussion much more than I can ever remember before. And so, yes, Jill Stein, who, if you were to look at her program and listen to her views on political issues, she does talk about the necessity of a change, a systematic change. And she has gotten more coverage. She also, I believe, yesterday, and I missed it unfortunately, she was on Fox News, which is Fox News at 9 o'clock in the evening.
Amazing.
And unfortunately, I wasn't able to listen to that. So now, when I give out literature, a lot of people recognize Jill Stein and that there is such a thing as a Green Party.
Well, we know that in Europe, the Green Party is much stronger there. I noticed that in Germany, very interesting, there's a town in Germany that has decided to move away from cars. It's called Vauban, Germany, and it's in a part of the country where the Green Party is very strong, right? And they're encouraging people to ride bicycles and things like that. So, I mean, obviously we have an environmental crisis that's facing us as a nation. Donald Trump denies that there is such a thing as global warming. Hillary, you know, she sort of has been pushed to the left by Bernie on this, I think, right? She's been pushed to the left as far as on fracking and that kind of thing. But the Green Party has had this issue right from the beginning as far as the environment, you know? Let's talk about you, Tom. How did you get active in politics? I mean, was there a connection between your teaching somehow and getting active in political activity?
Well, I'd say probably it dates back to when I joined the Peace Corps during the Kennedy administration. Wow. When he first organized it. And I didn't go into the Peace Corps for political reasons. I was thinking of perhaps, I wanted to learn Spanish and become fluent in it. And I figured that would be a good opportunity. And in those days, and that was during the Vietnam War, a lot of young people were going into the Peace Corps just to avoid getting drafted. That wasn't my motivation because I'd already been in the Navy. In fact, that was one of the reasons that I wanted to learn Spanish. I was our first trip outside the United States. I was on a cruiser, guided missile cruiser, was San Juan, Puerto Rico. And being in a Latin American country, in those days I thought that Puerto Rico was really a free associated state. I've learned since then that that's not the case. But so I was in San Juan, and wow, you know, what a completely different experience. And that got my interest going. Anyway, so I majored in history and in Spanish at the University of Connecticut when I left the Peace Corps. And then I decided that in order to become really fluent, that would be no, wait a minute, it was the other way around. When I left the Navy, I went to the University of Connecticut. When I got out of the University of Connecticut, I realized I was not fluent in Spanish, and that's when I joined the Peace Corps. And I lived in a small town with a family. They spoke no English for 2 years, and by the time I left Costa Rica, yo podía hablar más o menos bien español.
Wow. So anyway, you know, you could actually have conversations with my wife, Claudia, who's from Bogota, Colombia, and she's always getting on me to improve my Spanish. I might have to hire you as a tutor, Tom. Let's bring it up to the present day. We are about a month away now from a presidential election that's very interesting, and some people say could be dangerous, you know. What do you think about the Trump phenomenon, and what do you think is behind it? And let's take just a quick analysis of it anyway, to go deeper with an historian. We have an historian and an educator here, and give us your take on Trumpism and what it's all about.
Well, if you don't mind, I really didn't answer the first question. How did I really get interested in politics? And then I'll get into Trump. But when I left the Peace Corps, I decided to get my master's degree, and I was accepted at Columbia University. And that was at the height of the Vietnam War, and many of the universities were in open rebellion, including Columbia. The students had taken over the campus, and I was a student there. And that's when I became much more political than ever before. And then I got, after I retired, then I got a job as a high school teacher because I ran out of money at Columbia. And I thought, well, I'll temporarily get a job as a high school teacher. They were looking for bilingual teachers at the time. So anyway, I liked it a lot, and I wound up at George Washington High School for almost 30 years. And during that period of time, I came around to a type of politics. I would call myself a socialist, actually. And I started getting involved with the Green Party because it seemed to me that the Green Party, which does not accept contributions from big money, from the banks and the real estate lobby and big corporations, and is definitely anti-corporate, was a party that I could get involved with. So that's how I got involved politically. Now, the Trump phenomenon. I'm really amazed that Trump was able so easily to defeat all of those Republican candidates. His ability to speak well, his inability to say things that are not totally off the wall, to me is so obvious that I wonder whether the Republican Party leadership really wants to win this election, that they'll have somebody like Trump up there who probably will lose, and that means, of course, that Hillary will get in. So you wonder, well, why would they want that? And it could be that you mentioned the environmental crisis, but we also have a political and economic crisis in this country. And these crises are building. They're not being, can they even be addressed by the political system that we have now? And the whole thing may come to a head within the next 4 years. Well, if it comes to a head in a Democratic administration, then that would probably give the Republicans an opportunity to win the subsequent. And look what happened when the Great Depression hit and Hoover was in power. Yeah. The Republicans weren't able to elect a president after that until Eisenhower. What year was that Eisenhower got elected?
52.
So 1952. Yeah. So the Democrats controlled the presidency and the Congress, really, from 1934 or 32? 32 for 20 years.
Yeah.
So, because I'm at a loss as to how somebody as as sort of off the wall as Trump, what the Republican leadership probably never realized is that that the people of the United States are so tired of the the traditional political establishment of both parties, and that Trump is being perceived as an outsider, even though he's running as the Republican candidate, that he's not connected with the traditional political setup, that this has given him a great deal of popularity among people who are disgusted with the political system. And he's also tapping into a wellspring of anger and cynicism and resentment, especially among the white working class. Here, their jobs have been largely outsourced. Their living conditions have decreased, and of course, and he has these facile answers why this has happened. Blame it on the immigrants, and they buy into that. So all of this has resulted in, I think, an incredible popularity for Trump, coupled with a widespread dislike of Hillary Clinton. I won't go into all the reasons why she's disliked. So that's my analysis.
Great analysis, Tom. Wonderful, wonderful. And if I could just think about it a little bit, like when Trump first emerged on the scene, there was something comical. There was something interesting. I didn't like the racism part at all. I thought there was no need for that. I mean, I'm kind of somebody who likes to pick and choose and say, well, I like this from this person and this party and this from that party. And I'm really hoping that America could get its act together and have a real dialogue and say, well, this is good, that's bad, and not just sort of be so polarized, you know, and rejecting each other and demonizing each other. But Trump has those qualities that are obviously very, you know, the racist part. We don't like that. There's no call for that. But at the same time, he was also talking about issues that normally are talked about by the left, which is the outsourcing of jobs and what's happening to the blue-collar workers and the destruction of the factories in America, and let's bring back the factories, and his stance against the TPP. That has been a lefty position up until Trump. So, like, that makes it very complicated and makes it very, very interesting. Now, Hillary, who always represented the status quo, well, the Clintons came in as liberals, so-called liberals, in the early 90s. In 92, they ran. They got in 93. In 94, you had that contract with America and Newt Gingrich, and that sort of pushed the Clintons in a more centrist, and some people even say right-wing direction. But certainly, like you said, Hillary represents the status quo. Now, if Hillary wins, and we are in an anti-status quo moment on the left and the right, right? You got the Bernie people, anti-status quo. You got the Trump people, anti-status quo. What's going to happen if you have a status quo Democratic president with all of this anti-status quo energy? Can we sort of build alliances now between the left and the right, between the people who are with Trump, who, you know, maybe aren't so far out there, that, you know, the people who are, you know, who want our factories back? And how can we, is there any possibilities for coalition building here?
I don't see any possibility of any sort of united front coalition, say, between the right and the left. But there are, the Libertarian Party and the Green Party happen to have a common battle. And that is to open the political system to third parties, and both parties will not be able to engage in the debates, And will we even be given some time on our own to present our viewpoints on the mass media? Certainly this didn't happen 4 years ago. And, there was a time in, 30 years ago when the debates were organized by the League of Women Voters. And if you remember Ross Perot, in fact, even at that time, Ross Perot hit upon an issue. He called it the sucking sound, that our economy was being sucked overseas. Outsourcing, even at that time, and that hit a chord even at that time, and he got a substantial amount of the vote. I forgot what the percentage was, maybe 15% of the national vote. Well, the Republicans and Democrats, when they saw that, they pulled out of the national debates as organized by the League of Women Voters, and they organized their own commission. And from then on in, no third party was allowed in the debates. Wow. So we have that in common with the Libertarians, and both of us are working together on that issue. We happen to also, both of us, agree on personal liberties. We don't believe that the government should be snooping on us, tapping our phones and all this sort of thing. And we believe that the drugs should be decriminalized and marijuana should be legalized. Both parties believe that. And both parties believe that we should not be the world policemen and expend all of our these resources and money on overthrowing other governments overseas in order to take control of these governments. We both agreed to that as well, reducing our military budget. But we part company with the conservatives and with the libertarians on the role of government. We think that government does have a role in providing for the general welfare of the population, and we think that Social Security and a national health care program for all should be put into effect, while the libertarians do not believe that government has that role.
Wow. Yeah, one of the issues, Tom, also we've been talking about on our show is the idea of a shorter work week. That if America, had a 25-hour work week instead of now, by law it's 40 hours, but in reality people are working 50, 60 hours a week. And if we divided that up, instead of one person working 50 hours a week, two people work 25 hours, and we had a more equitable distribution of wealth, so the CEO is not making like 500 times the average worker, which it is now, you might have a better, a more relaxed population, a happier population, a population that could actually think critically, that had time to read, that had time to engage in political activity. So there's that. We saw Ralph Nader Sunday at the Brooklyn Book Festival. Claudia and I were there at the annual wonderful Brooklyn Book Festival. Ralph was there, and we didn't go to his discussion, but I wanted to go just to shake his hand and say to him, I think you're a national hero and a national treasure, and he appreciated that because he gave us seatbelts. The man gave us seatbelts. The man is an incredible crusader. Millions of lives saved, Ralph Nader, So what's your take on Ralph Nader?
Well, here again, I've run into this thing from many, many Democrats that Ralph Nader was responsible for Gore losing the election and for us getting stuck with Bush. Even though Gore himself never, in fact, Gore said they didn't think that was a major factor at all, that it was much more complex than that, including his lackluster campaign, his association with Clinton, and it's not putting forth sharply the issues. I think that the idea that somehow, if the election is going to be close between the two major parties, that the small independent party should stay home is totally undemocratic. And actually having a two-party system, NATO calls it, I believe, the duopoly, which it is, on most of the basic issues, especially economic and political issues and foreign issues, both parties are the same. And so to say that the American people should be denied alternative points of view in the political system, and that there's only room enough for two parties, particularly if both parties can't distinguish themselves enough where people, where it's going to be a close election, right, to me undermines the whole, any effort to democratize our system.
Wow, well put, Tom. You know, when I think about the role that corporations are playing in our society, increasingly dominating not only the political culture after Citizens United, this terrible Supreme Court decision that gives corporations unlimited access to fund elections, right, which ought to be overturned immediately. And I think about increasingly the corporate control of our media. This show that you're watching, ladies and gentlemen, we're not corporate controlled. We survive on donations from people and grants. You know, we're a nonprofit show, so we don't have, you know, any particular agenda. And also the education system. You worked in education, so you see increasingly, you know, the use of standardized testing. Increasingly, the business major is encouraged, marketing majors. You know, people don't study critical subjects like the humanities as much or the arts anymore. So we need to get back to critical thinking. And I think, I want to know what you think on this, that peace is something that needs to be educated for. We need to educate for peace. I was in an activity this week in Union Square Park, which was a public space art performance called Connect for Peace. And we had these bungee cords, a bunch of us connected to each other, and there was music playing, and we wanted to show that we are all interconnected with each other through these rubber bungee cords. We were dancing in public, and somebody was making announcements about peace, you know, how we're all connected. Even people who don't have bungee cords connected, we all have connections between us. Just imagine if we had a country and a world that had peaceful people in it, that we don't have wars anymore. Is that being too idealistic, Tom?
Well, certainly we should strive for something like that, but whether it's idealistic or not. Because the alternative is to have these constant wars, which can get out of control. And here you have the major powers with huge nuclear arsenals. Yeah. And so this is extremely dangerous. But a question comes to my mind: can the economic system that we have these days, the kind of capitalism that we have, can that system maintain itself without war?
Yes. Right.
What do you think about that?
That's a great question, because very often it's been said that when America was in the Great Depression, that it wasn't the social programs that got us out, it was World War II. If that is the case, and if capitalism requires warfare in order to function at its best, then maybe obviously capitalism is not a great system. What system that's based on warfare can possibly be good? You know, Claudia and I are both Christians, so we believe love thy neighbor as yourself. Cornel West is somebody I admire very much, and a couple of years ago I saw Cornel give a lecture in Newark, New Jersey, at a church, Bethany Baptist Church, and the first thing he mentioned was the nuclear weapons and he said that, and this is something, you can watch news, you can go home and you can watch Fox Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, when this show is over, you can watch MSNBC. Nobody talks about the nuclear threat. And Cornel West said, you know, we could all die tonight. We could all die tonight with these darn weapons that are on hair trigger alert. So I think we need to be moving in a direction of peacefulness. Who is it? Dennis Kucinich. He advocated for a U.S. Department of Peace at the cabinet level, that there would be an actual Department of Peace to educate for peace, so that human beings can be taught to be more caring and loving. All right, so capitalism creates war. Socialism is about social peace, right? Would you say, or does socialism? Let's talk about that. Okay.
If we look back at history, unfortunately, people identify the word socialist with what happened in the Soviet Union. Now, did the Soviet Union really have any choice of building a peaceful society without a strong, centralized, undemocratic bureaucracy and military? Did they have to go in that direction? Well, we know that at the very beginning of the Russian, or once the Bolsheviks took over Russia, all of the major capitalist countries got together and invaded Russia to overthrow the government. Well, they had no choice but to have a centralized government with a strong military to resist that, the formation of the Red Army and all that. And then, as they were building their form of socialism in Russia during the 1920s and 30s, you had the emergence of fascism, Nazism, that was obviously a threat to communism. In Germany, by 1932, I believe the Communist Party was more numerous than the Nazi Party, but the industrialists, the bourgeoisie in Germany, they looked at the communists, of course, as a greater threat to them than the Nazis were, so they put their resources over to the Nazis. So then you had World War II. And what would have happened if the Soviet Union had not industrialized and had not built up a strong military and were defeated by the Nazis? Who knows what would have happened? But in any case, that type of socialism, I think, failed because it was not, from the grassroots, it was not truly democratic. So when we talk about socialism as a system that can address these crises, the environmental crisis, the economic crisis, the political crisis, we have to talk about a democratic socialism, not just use the word socialist. Because we know what happened to centralized bureaucratic socialism in Russia, and look at what's happening in China.
Very, very eloquent. Boy, it's so wonderful to have an historian on our show and somebody with your critical analyses, Tom. It's always a pleasure to talk to you on the air, off the air. And I want people to know, again, that this is a show that really celebrates the power of dialogue, Socratic dialogue, interactions like this. And our education system, we think, needs to get back to that. And I remember, my grandmother used to tell me a lot of stories, and my grandmother used to work in New York City. She was working as a bank teller back in the 1920s, and she said, and in the 1930s, that there were all these rallies in Central Park, socialist, communist rallies, and there's a theory that that's what kept the Democratic Party more to the left, because you had a strong far-left movement here organized. Union movements were very strong. Now the unions are down to like 6%. They one time had 35%. My dad was in a labor union. He was president of his union of backstage theater workers. So in terms of the future, do you think the country's moving to the right? Or do you think if we could sort of bring it back with kind of Occupy to Bernie to Jill Stein?
Well, that's hard to say, but I do see certain things happening that that gives me a certain amount of optimism. First of all, the Occupy Wall Street movement. Now, some people think, well, that totally failed. But you know that they just celebrated their fifth anniversary, and they were down in Zuccotti Square the other day. I was there. In fact, they invited me to speak on the housing crisis, which maybe we can get into in a little while. And they do have ongoing committees connected with Occupy Wall Street, addressing issues. Of course, the government came down really hard on them when they spread out from New York City into other public spaces throughout the United States. But the Occupy Wall Street movement, taking up on what was happening in the Arab Spring, like in Egypt, and Zahir Square is that the name of the place? Yeah. They did something that was quite unique. Until then, there were big demonstrations, but these demonstrations were just for the day, and then everybody went home and back to so-called normalcy. And of course, the mass media minimized these demonstrations. And then there were even short strikes. In Europe, maybe even a general strike that lasted a couple of days, but then it was over with. But following the example of what happened in Cairo, the Occupy Wall Street movement, they stayed there day after day after day. And this movement started to catch on, and the mass media couldn't ignore it, and the government really felt threatened. And I was there when the police, the tactical police, helmeted with all kinds of military equipment, descended on Zuccotti Square and forced everybody out of there, confiscated all of their belongings, and just trashed everything, and that happened throughout the country. People don't realize what kind of oppression that amounted to, but that's still there. Then we have the phenomenon with the black community confronting police brutality. Now, this is nothing new. Police shooting black people, trigger happy, lynch. Remember the lynchings? That lasted probably up through the 1950s. Well, there's a new militancy and awareness among blacks, particularly younger blacks, that they're not going to accept this anymore. And and then you have, everybody has these little cameras and what have you. So we have a growing movement against this kind of racism, and the whole question of what the police are about, the possibility of even considering reorganizing the police completely, maybe have the police controlled by the communities involved. Remember community control of the school system? That was suppressed. But the whole concept of community control, grassroots democracy is not dead. And then we have what happened in North Dakota at the Standing Rock Reservation, where you have these big oil and gas companies. They want to build these pipelines through Indian reservations and other places. And by the way, why are they given permits by our government, which is supposedly, you said that the Democratic leadership says it believes in climate change. Well, how can you control climate change if you're not making a serious effort to get off gas and oil, to get off fossil fuels, and to put all of your efforts into transitioning over to clean solar and wind and geothermal water energy? And at the same time, you're building gas lines and oil pipelines, and continually drilling for gas and oil, and even coal mining, continuing with that. So you're having a reaction among people that are. It's not only Indian reservations. I mean, the people here in the New York State managed to pressure putting a moratorium on fracking here. But so these are good indications.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, I think about how much work we have to do here in our country in terms of critical thinking, in terms of knowledge, in terms of think about reading, and just people getting back to reading books. And I realize how much I learned in reading about the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, people like Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse, and they basically were neo-Marxists, and there was this Institute for Social Research founded in the 1920s in this country with the money of a wealthy businessman named Herman Weil. So I think somewhere Marx says that you need to have coalitions between the proletariat, between the people, the working people, and a few people on top who are good, who have money, who want to help, So there's sort of like, a way that you don't want to just demonize everybody who's not on your side, to build coalitions, to build movements, it takes a little bit of money also, So as far as organizing, where do you see, because you're a great organizer, you were the chair of the Manhattan Green Party. Talk a little bit about that. What was life like to be the chair of, that's like, to me, that's like royalty.
Well, the Green Party here in New York City, we have locals, which are independent, really, of the structure of the Green Party, but we are connected voluntarily with the Green Party, and we put up candidates. Like this time, we're having candidates throughout the city running for the State Assembly, the State Senate, and we have somebody running for U.S. Senate, Robin Wilson. She's challenging Schumer. We have two people running for U.S. Congress. Daniel Vila is running for the seat up in Harlem that was occupied by Charlie Rangel. So that was one part of the activity of the Manhattan Green local as well as the other locals. But another part was to get involved with other grassroots organizations such as tenant movements. I happen to be chair of the Committee to Protect Rent Control, which is a special case of a relatively small group of tenants that have been largely forgotten that and are hit with high increases. You know that there are over 1 million rent stabilized tenants in New York City, and their rents determined by the mayoral appointed Rent Guidelines Board. But because there are so many of them, and Mayor de Blasio, he's under fire for his housing, his inclusionary housing and zoning plan, he has, for the first time, enabled or instructed the Rent Guidelines Board to freeze the rents of rent-stabilized tenants for 1 year. He did it last year, and he did it again this year. But there are only about 40,000 rent-controlled tenants left in the city. Because when a rent control apartment is vacated, it's supposed to go over to rent stabilization. Well, rent control has been more or less under vacancy decontrol since 1971, 72. So now we're talking about 45 years where controlled tenants have died off or moved out, and all of those apartments went, not all of them, many of them went to market rate, but most of them went over to rent stabilization. In fact, the only reason I'm living in this kind of apartment, I have a rent control apartment. I moved in here in 1971. In those days, people were moving out of the city. The city was in bad financial straits. In fact, I think that we wound up under a financial control board, which meant turning over the city to the big banks, which had just happened in Puerto Rico, by the way, another financial control board. And there was a lot of crime, a lot of drug addiction. People were moving out. But in those days, all of the, not all of them, but most of the tenants living in older buildings like this one were rent-controlled tenants. And so when I started looking for an apartment, it was easy for me to get an apartment under rent control. I was able to afford, as a beginning teacher, the rent in this apartment. Those days are over. And so if you want, we can talk a little bit about the housing crisis.
Well, again, this is such a wonderful dialogue, and you're such a kind person, Tom. You're a sweet guy. We care a lot about you. We want to say that. And you have a great, sharp, critical intelligence, married to a decency and a kindness and a warmth. I was going to go to an event this past week at the Henry George School of Social Science. Henry George was like a contemporary. He came a little after Marx. He wasn't as radical as Marx, but he was very critical of land ownership, Henry George. And there is a school in New York, the Henry George School of Social Science. And they were having an event this week. They had a Catholic priest come in and give a talk about this crisis and rent and high, cost of living, and that certain things should be free, if not very affordable, such as rent. I didn't go because there was a World Peace Party. September 21st was the International Day of Peace at the United Nations has declared a new holiday. I don't know if you know that, but it's a new holiday, so we were celebrating that. But I will be going back to the Henry George School, and I've given a few lectures there already also. I just finished writing a play. It's a one-man show called How to Be an Actor in Your Own Life. How to Be an Actor in Your Own Life. And this play is very critical of Broadway and Hollywood. In fact, the tagline of the play is, A Planet-Saving Guide to Broadway and Hollywood. A Planet-Saving Guide to Broadway and Hollywood. And in this play, I call for things like utopia. I say, I think I want utopia now. We can work out the details later. You know, there's more than enough money to go around. We could spread it around more equitably. Nobody needs to be homeless. You know, rent could be much, much cheaper, right? But when I say about culture, I'm interested also in asking you, do you have any favorite movies, any favorite novels or books, or any works of art that inculcate a sort of a, you know, a vision of a better world, and more, you know, in terms of or think about in terms of your cultural background, in terms of movies, plays, theater, poetry, anything like that?
Well, recently I've been interested in. I've bought a couple of books. One is The Counter-Revolution of 1775. No, I'm sorry. The Counter-Revolution of 1776. This was written by a black historian who interprets the American Revolution not as really as a progressive democratic revolution, but a revolution to foster the interests of the domestic ruling class in this country, the slave owners and merchants, and the people that lost out were the indigenous people in particular, and who, by the way, sympathized with the British, by and large, because they knew that they were in grave danger. The British did not allow white colonists to go over the Appalachian Mountains. Why? Because they had a very good, lucrative trade with the Indians in furs, and they did not want that to be interrupted. And also they were concerned with the growth of an independent-minded, domestic European settlers, and so to coop them up along the eastern coast was in their interest. And of course, the slave owners, the British also knew from their problems they were having with slavery in the Caribbean that they had to figure out another way of exploiting black labor than slavery. It was untenable for a tiny group of white planters, say in the island of Jamaica or Barbados, to continue to exploit black labor through slavery. One rebellion could end the whole thing. In fact, that happened in Haiti later on. So they were considering phasing out slavery at the end of the even by the end of the 18th century. Well, the slave owners here in the United States, they were terrified of that. And anyway, that was that. I'm reading that book now. Okay. And another book is Ebony and Ivy, the role of the Ivy League schools in this country in their formation, getting funded through the slave trade. You know that the early Puritans, once they went into shipping and the slave trade, they became the Boston Brahmins, and these people became very, very wealthy, and they used that money to establish or to build on these universities, Harvard and Yale and William and Mary and what have you. So I'm reading these two books right now. As far as movies, I just saw one of the Ingmar Bergman movies.
Oh, you love that. I love him.
The one about death. You must know the movie. This
The chess player one?
yeah, the chess player. What was the name of that movie?
I forget, but I love Ingmar Bergman. That's
Yeah.
one of my favorite
So the squire
Yes.
and his sidekick, they came back from the Crusades, and both of them were very, realized how that this was not the thing that they went there thinking that they were going to try to rescue the Holy Land from the infidels, and they wound up that wasn't the what happened at all, and they came back to Sweden, and right in the middle of a plague, and so people were dying right and left, and so the squire he wanted to find out what life was all about, what God was all about before he died, and he knew that the figure of death had appeared to him and was following him around, and he made a deal to postpone his death by challenging the figure of death to chess games. Now, what is the name of that movie? Anyway, that was the last movie that I saw recently that I liked very much.
That's great. This is an historic moment on our show because you're the first person to bring up an Ingmar Bergman film, and we've had the show for 6 years, and Ingmar Bergman is one of my heroes. I love him. I love his work. I love his film work. His films are very deep and sensitive and psychological. Wild Strawberries is one of my all-time favorite movies. Woody Allen, I think, is a great fan of Bergman as well, because one of my favorite Woody Allen movies is called Husbands and Wives from 1972, and he mentions Wild Strawberries in that movie too. So this is wonderful. What a great discourse on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where cultural life is still alive, where intellectual life is still alive. We didn't have to cut to a commercial because we're a humane show. We're not a marketing-oriented show, and we had an hour with the secretary of the Manhattan Green Party, former president of the Manhattan Green Party, Mr. Tom Siracuse, doing some incredible work, amazing work in the world, and we support your efforts, Tom, and anytime you want to be a guest, you come back. We care very much about you, and keep up the amazing work.
Well, I suppose time is up.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, and hope we have these conversations again. And I'm very grateful that we have people like you that have these kinds of shows. And we have something like Manhattan Neighborhood Network. It's a great opportunity for people with alternative views to be heard.
So we can remember what real conversation is, and we can also, even myself, always learning how to have better conversations on shows like this with people like you, Tom. So let's keep hanging out and deepen our friendship. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you and to Claudia.
Yes.
And I hope
Something in Spanish to Claudia.
muchas gracias, Claudia. Que aunque no se ve en los shows, ella está aquí haciendo posible este programa.
Thank you, Tom.
The conversation will go on. Thank you.